It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing out of the ordinary ever occurred. Tucked away from the bustling city, this quiet little community felt like a sanctuary. Mornings began with the cheerful chirping of birds and the soft rustling of leaves swaying in the gentle breeze. Afternoons echoed with children's laughter, and evenings were spent beneath the warm glow of porch lights where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over freshly brewed coffee. It was a place built on trust, where secrets were rare, or so they believed. But one seemingly ordinary morning, an unusual sound disrupted the usual harmony. At first it was faint, like a low groan or a muffled growl, barely noticeable over the daily hum of life. Most dismissed it, assuming it was just the wind or a stray animal passing through. However, one neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Karen, couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. She was the kind of person who paid attention to the small details, the things others often overlooked. And this sound, it wasn't normal. As days passed, it became harder to ignore. The noise seemed to come from the backyard of a house that had long been the subject of quiet speculation. The homeowner, a reclusive man who rarely interacted with anyone, kept to himself. His tall wooden fence was unwelcoming, and his yard was eerily silent. But Karen, driven by equal parts curiosity and concern, decided to take a closer look. On a chilly Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, she ventured out with a flashlight in hand. The air was thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The closer she got to the fence, the louder the sound became. It wasn't just a growl, it was a deep, guttural noise filled with pain and desperation. Karen's heart pounded as she approached a small gap between the wooden slats. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There, in the shadows of the backyard, stood a bear. Its massive body was bound by heavy chains, restricting its movement to a small, filthy patch of ground. Its fur was matted, its ribs visible beneath the coarse coat. The animal's eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, met Karen's gaze through the gap. She stumbled back, her mind racing to process what she had just seen. A bear, chained, here in this peaceful neighborhood. Questions flooded her thoughts. How did the bear get there? Who would do such a thing? And most importantly, how long had it been suffering in silence, hidden in plain sight? The tranquil facade of the neighborhood shattered in that moment, replaced by a grim and urgent reality. Karen knew she couldn't ignore what she had seen. This wasn't just a mystery, it was a cry for help. With her heart pounding and her mind racing, Karen turned back toward her house. She had to act quickly, but every decision felt like walking a tightrope. Should she call the authorities? What if the bear was dangerous? What if her involvement put her at risk? But as she glanced back at the shadowy figure behind the fence, she knew one thing for certain: doing nothing wasn't an option. Karen sat at her kitchen table, staring at the phone in front of her. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, only to pull back again. The image of the bear, its chained body and pleading eyes, was etched into her mind. She couldn't shake it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw its desperation, heard its low, guttural cries. But making the call felt like crossing an invisible line, one that could put her in the middle of something much bigger than she was ready to handle. The first thought that plagued her was fear. What if the man who owned the house found out it was her? He wasn't the type to mingle with neighbors or join the annual block parties. In fact, his presence was so elusive that most people barely noticed him at all. But now, knowing what lay behind those tall fences, his silence seemed more menacing. What kind of person keeps a bear in their backyard? And what might he do if he found out someone had reported him? The idea sent a shiver down her spine. Karen looked out the window toward the house in question. The wooden fence stood like a fortress, hiding the grim secret within. Her heart pounded as her imagination ran wild with worst-case scenarios: retaliation, threats, even violence. She considered them all. She wasn't just afraid for herself, but also for her family. What if her actions put them in harm's way? Was she willing to take that risk? But as fear gripped her, another voice in her mind began to speak. It was quieter at first, but it grew louder with every passing moment. The voice of compassion. That bear didn't choose to be there. It didn't have the luxury of deciding whether or not to speak up for itself. It was suffering in silence, trapped and forgotten. How could she ignore that? How could she let her fear outweigh the moral obligation to help a living creature in such dire need? Karen wrestled with the idea of walking away, convincing herself it wasn't her problem, that someone else would eventually notice and take action. But deep down, she knew the truth. No one else had noticed. Days had already turned into weeks, and the bear was still there, hidden from sight but not from suffering. If she didn't act, who would? And how long would the bear have to endure its misery before someone stepped in? The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity as Karen's mind raced. The thought of doing nothing felt unbearable, but the fear of the unknown paralyzed her. She was torn between two powerful emotions, fear and compassion. In that moment, she realized she was standing at a crossroads, and whatever decision she made would define not only the bear's fate, but her own. Finally, with trembling hands, Karen reached for the phone once more. Her voice wavered as she began to dial. Karen's fingers hovered over the keypad, her breathing shallow as she finally completed the call to animal control. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as she explained the situation. She described the bear in the backyard, the chains, the conditions. The person on the other end of the line sounded calm, but Karen could tell from their tone that this wasn't something they dealt with every day. They assured her they would send someone, but also mentioned protocol required notifying the authorities since a wild animal was involved. That statement alone sent a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through her. Hanging up the phone, Karen's hands felt clammy. The seconds ticked by in excruciating silence as she waited, unsure of what would happen next. Would animal control arrive quietly, taking care of the bear without too much attention? Or would the presence of the police stir up something far bigger than she had anticipated? She glanced nervously out her window, watching the neighbor's house, her stomach churning with dread. Within half an hour, the faint sound of sirens broke through the stillness of the evening. Karen's heart sank. She peeked out the window to see two animal control vehicles pulling up, followed closely by a police car. Officers stepped out, scanning the neighborhood as if searching for someone to explain the situation. Karen ducked back from the window, her heart pounding. She hadn't planned on becoming part of a spectacle. The commotion didn't go unnoticed. Doors creaked open along the street as curious neighbors stepped out, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. A small group began to gather, whispering to one another, their eyes darting toward the house with the towering wooden fence. "What's going on?" someone murmured. Another neighbor replied, "I heard it's about an animal." Something dangerous, maybe. Karen felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't wanted to cause a scene, but now the situation had taken on a life of its own. She stayed hidden behind her curtain, her chest tight with apprehension. Would her neighbor know she was the one who made the call? She didn't want recognition. She just wanted the bear to be safe. But the reality of what was unfolding outside was far more overwhelming than she had anticipated. Meanwhile, the police and animal control agents approached the house. One officer knocked on the front door, while another walked along the perimeter of the fence, trying to get a sense of what they were dealing with. When the homeowner finally opened the door, the interaction was brief. The officers asked to investigate the backyard, and though the man looked visibly agitated, he eventually relented. From Karen's window, she could see the tension growing. The officers stepped into the yard, their movements deliberate and cautious. Within moments, the grim reality came into full view. The bear, chained and immobile, its eyes reflecting years of suffering. The officers' expressions darkened as they exchanged words with the animal control agents. Karen couldn't hear them, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. As the bear's condition became apparent, word began to spread quickly through the small crowd of neighbors. Speculation turned into outrage. "How could someone do this?" one woman exclaimed. "That poor animal," another added. The murmur of voices grew louder as more people joined, their curiosity turning into anger. The tension in the air was palpable. Karen felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had taken the first step, but the situation was far from over. What had started as a simple call for help was rapidly snowballing into something far bigger than she could have imagined. And as the officers began speaking into their radios, signaling for additional support, Karen realized this was only the beginning. The officers were still in the backyard when more vehicles arrived. 2 unmarked police cars and an additional van marked with the logo of a wildlife rescue organization. The sight of these reinforcements sent a ripple through the gathering crowd. Whispers turned into gasps, and Karen felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just about the bear. Something much larger was unfolding. In the backyard, the officers took photos and spoke in hushed tones. One of them examined the bear's chains while another inspected the surrounding area. It didn't take long for them to notice the signs of neglect. The bear's patch of ground was littered with scraps of rotten food and piles of waste. A rusted metal bowl sat nearby, filled with murky water. It was clear that this animal hadn't received proper care for a long time. The homeowner stood to the side, visibly irritated as officers continued their investigation. He offered vague explanations, claiming the bear had been rescued as a cub and that he had been caring for it ever since. But his story didn't hold up under scrutiny. One of the officers pressed him for details, where he had acquired the bear, why it was chained up, and whether he had the necessary permits to keep such a dangerous animal. The man stumbled over his words, his frustration giving way to defensiveness. Meanwhile, in the far corner of the yard, one officer noticed something unusual. Tucked behind a makeshift shed was a small stack of wooden crates, each one marked with strange symbols and numbers. Upon closer inspection, the officer realized these weren't ordinary crates. They were shipping containers, the kind used to transport animals. He called for backup, and soon a team of investigators began to comb through the property. Inside the shed, the discoveries became even more disturbing. There were tools and supplies that hinted at a larger operation: tranquilizer darts, syringes, and chains of various sizes. There were also ledgers filled with handwritten entries detailing transactions that spanned months, if not years. Each entry listed animals by species, weight, and price. The names of buyers and sellers were coded, but the pattern was unmistakable. This was evidence of an underground exotic animal trafficking ring. Word of the discovery spread like wildfire. The neighborhood, once quiet and peaceful, was now buzzing with shock and outrage. Neighbors who had always assumed the man was just a quiet recluse now saw him in an entirely different light. "How could this happen right under our noses?" one man exclaimed. "We trusted him," another woman added, her voice shaking with anger. Karen stood by her window, her hands gripping the curtain tightly. She felt a mix of emotions: relief that the authorities were uncovering the truth, but also disbelief at the scale of what was happening. The thought of other animals suffering in similar conditions made her stomach churn. This wasn't just about one bear. It was about an entire network of cruelty and exploitation. As the investigation unfolded, officers began removing evidence from the property. Crates were loaded into vans and the ledgers were carefully bagged for further analysis. The bear, still chained, watched the commotion with wide, wary eyes. It seemed to sense that something was changing, though its trust in humans had likely been shattered long ago. The homeowner was eventually placed in handcuffs, his protests drowned out by the noise of the crowd. As he was escorted to a waiting police car, the reality of his actions began to sink in for everyone watching. This wasn't just a case of neglect, it was a crime that had far-reaching implications. The man's arrest was the first step in what would become a much larger investigation, one that promised to expose a dark and hidden world. For Karen, the aftermath was bittersweet. While she was relieved that the bear was finally safe and that justice was being pursued, she couldn't help but feel a lingering sadness. The image of the bear, chained and helpless, haunted her thoughts. She often replayed the moments leading up to her decision to call for help, questioning whether she had done enough or acted quickly enough. But deep down, she knew that even one act of courage could ripple outward, creating change in ways she might never fully understand. The neighborhood itself began to transform, not just physically but emotionally. The tall fence that had hidden so much was dismantled, leaving the property exposed to the world. The once reclusive homeowner's house stood empty, a stark reminder of the horrors that had been uncovered. But alongside the sadness and anger, there was a growing sense of hope. Neighbors who had once been distant or indifferent began to come together, united by a shared desire to make their community a better place. As weeks turned into months, the bear's story remained a touchstone for many in the neighborhood. Updates from the wildlife sanctuary where it had been taken became a source of comfort and inspiration. Photos of the bear, now healthier and living in a spacious, natural habitat, were shared widely on social media. Each image was a reminder of what had been accomplished and of the work that still needed to be done. In the end, the bear's rescue was more than just a single act of compassion. It was a catalyst for change, both in the lives of those who had witnessed it and in the broader community. The neighborhood, once known for its quiet streets and friendly faces, now carried a new legacy, one of vigilance, empathy, and a commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The bear's journey to freedom didn't end the day it was rescued. It was only the beginning of a long path toward recovery. After being transported to a wildlife rehabilitation center several hours away, the bear was placed in the care of a specialized team of veterinarians and animal behaviorists. These experts had seen cases like this before, though each one carried its own heartbreak. The bear, emaciated and deeply traumatized, needed more than just food and medical attention. It needed time, patience, and a safe environment to heal both its body and spirit. At the center, the bear was given its own enclosure, far larger than the small patch of dirt it had been confined to for years. It was surrounded by trees, a small pond, and plenty of space to roam, things it had likely never experienced before. For the first few days, it stayed close to the edges of its new home, hesitant to explore. Its movements were slow and uncertain, as though it couldn't believe the chains were really gone. Every sound and shadow seemed to startle it, a testament to the years of fear and neglect it had endured. The veterinarians conducted a full health assessment, confirming what many had feared. The bear was malnourished, its muscles weakened from lack of use, and its fur was patchy from untreated skin conditions. But despite its physical state, the team saw signs of resilience in the bear's eyes. It still had a spark of life, a will to survive that gave them hope. They began a careful regimen of nutritious meals, medical treatments, and behavioral therapy to help the bear regain its strength and trust. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the bear began to transform. Its fur grew thicker and shinier, and its weight increased as it adapted to a healthy diet. For the first time, it could run and climb without restraint, rediscovering instincts that had long been suppressed. The pond became a favorite spot, where it would splash and cool off on warm days. The bear's progress was documented by the rehabilitation team, who shared updates with the community that had been so invested in its story. Karen followed these updates closely. She had never forgotten the moment she first saw the bear, chained and broken, through the gap in the fence. The images of its recovery brought tears to her eyes, but they also filled her with a sense of pride. She had played a small role in giving this animal a second chance, and now she longed to see it for herself. By the end of the day, the bear was carefully sedated and loaded into the wildlife rescue van. Its chains were finally removed, and for the first time in what must have been years, it was no longer tethered to the ground. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as the van pulled away, a symbol of hope and justice amid the chaos. Karen watched it all unfold with tears in her eyes. The neighborhood she thought she knew would never be the same, but perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. People were talking, asking questions, and vowing to be more vigilant. The bear's suffering had brought a hidden evil to light, and while the truth was painful, it was also necessary. As night fell, Karen sat quietly, replaying the day's events in her mind. She had done what she could, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The bear was safe, but how many others were still out there, chained and suffering in silence? It was a question that would haunt her, even as she found solace in knowing she had taken the first step toward making a difference. The moment the wildlife rescue team approached the bear, the air seemed to grow heavier. Though the chains had already been cut, the bear remained curled in on itself, its massive body trembling with fear. Years of neglect and confinement had stripped it of any instinct to trust humans. Its eyes darted between the unfamiliar faces surrounding it, its ragged breath audible even from a distance. The team moved cautiously, their voices low and steady, as they worked to minimize the bear's stress. One of the rescuers, a woman with years of experience handling traumatized animals, knelt a few feet away. She held out her hand, not with food, but as a gesture of reassurance. The bear's massive paw shifted slightly, its chains clinking faintly on the ground. It wasn't an act of aggression, but one of uncertainty, as if it couldn't decide whether to retreat or stay still. The team knew the next step would be crucial. The bear's size and strength made it potentially dangerous, even in its weakened state. They decided to sedate it to ensure a safe transfer. A tranquilizer gun was brought forward, and a dart was carefully prepared. The crowd that had gathered held their breath as one of the rescuers aimed. The dart found its mark, and after a few tense moments, the bear's body began to relax. Its breathing slowed, and the tightness in its muscles eased as it succumbed to the effects of the sedative. As soon as the bear was immobilized, the team sprang into action. A specially designed cage was wheeled into the yard. The rescuers worked quickly but gently, carefully lifting the bear into the transport cage. Even in its sedated state, the bear's sheer size required the combined strength of several people. Every movement was deliberate, ensuring that the animal wasn't further harmed or frightened. Karen stood at her window, her hands pressed against the glass, unable to tear her eyes away. She felt an overwhelming wave of emotion, relief, sadness, hope, all colliding at once. She hadn't realized she was crying until she wiped her cheeks and saw the dampness on her fingers. Outside, the crowd murmured softly as the rescuers secured the cage and began preparing it for transport. The bear's chains were removed at last. The sight of the heavy metal links being cut away was met with audible gasps and even a few cheers from the onlookers. For the first time, the bear was free from the physical restraints that had bound it for years. It was a symbolic moment, one that seemed to ripple through the crowd. Strangers exchanged glances, some smiling, others wiping away tears. As the cage was lifted onto the rescue van, the bear's massive frame looked almost peaceful. Though still unconscious, it no longer bore the visible signs of fear and agitation. It was as if the weight of its suffering had finally been lifted, if only for a little while. The rescuers double-checked the cage's locks and secured it inside the vehicle, ensuring the bear's safety for the journey ahead. The crowd erupted into applause as the van's doors closed. It was a moment of collective relief, a rare instance where everyone seemed united in their joy and hope for the bear's future. Karen stepped outside, drawn by the energy of the crowd. She stood near the edge, watching as the van slowly pulled away. A soft cheer followed its departure, the sound growing fainter as the vehicle disappeared down the street. One sunny afternoon, Karen drove to the sanctuary, her heart pounding with anticipation. As she approached the visitor area, a staff member greeted her warmly and led her to a viewing platform overlooking the bear's enclosure. Karen's breath caught as she saw the bear, now a picture of health, lounging in the shade of a tree. Its coat gleamed in the sunlight, and its posture was relaxed, so different from the frightened, chained creature she had once seen. The staff member explained how far the bear had come, recounting stories of its progress and moments of joy it had experienced since arriving at the sanctuary. Karen listened intently, her eyes never leaving the bear. It was hard to believe this was the same animal. She watched as it stood, stretched, and wandered over to the pond, dipping its massive paw into the water before stepping in fully. The sight was so simple, yet so profound. Karen felt a lump in her throat, a mix of overwhelming relief and gratitude. For a moment, the bear paused and looked toward the platform, its gaze meeting Karen's. She couldn't be sure if it recognized her, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the bear was free, truly free for the first time in its life. Karen smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. This was why she had made that call. This was the reward for her courage. As Karen left the sanctuary, she carried the memory of the bear with her, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what compassion could achieve. The bear's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, hope, and the power of one small act to create ripples of change. For Karen, it was a lesson she would carry with her forever. Karen's life had changed in ways she never anticipated. What began as a quiet decision to help an animal in distress had snowballed into a story that resonated far beyond her small neighborhood. The rescue of the bear and the subsequent investigation into the exotic animal trafficking ring had drawn attention from local news outlets and wildlife advocacy groups. While Karen had never sought recognition, she found herself at the center of a story that inspired others to take a stand for what was right. Her neighbors, who had once been distant acquaintances, now saw her in a new light. People stopped by her house to thank her for her bravery, often bringing flowers, cards, or homemade treats as tokens of appreciation. "You've reminded us all of what it means to be a good neighbor," one elderly woman had said, her voice filled with emotion. Karen often felt overwhelmed by the attention, but she also understood its importance. Her actions had ignited a conversation about responsibility, empathy, and the hidden suffering that often goes unnoticed. Karen's story didn't just touch her immediate community, it reached far beyond it. Wildlife organizations began reaching out to her, asking if she would share her experience at events or in interviews. At first, Karen hesitated. She wasn't a public speaker, and the thought of standing in front of a crowd made her nervous. But the more she reflected on the bear's journey, the more she realized that its story needed to be told. It wasn't just about one animal, it was about the countless others that remained unseen, suffering in silence. At a local wildlife advocacy event, Karen stood behind a podium, her hands gripping the edges nervously. She glanced at the audience, a mixture of familiar faces from her neighborhood and strangers who had come to hear her speak. Taking a deep breath, she began to tell the story, not of herself, but of the bear. She spoke of its suffering, its rescue, and its remarkable recovery. She described the moment she made the call, the fear and doubt that had gripped her, and the profound sense of relief she felt when the bear was finally freed. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. She didn't speak as an expert or an activist. She spoke as an ordinary person who had faced an extraordinary situation. "I didn't think I was brave," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I just knew I couldn't look away. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't about being fearless. It's about caring enough to act, even when you're scared." The audience erupted into applause, but Karen wasn't focused on the recognition. What mattered to her was the message. If one person in the room left feeling inspired to take action, then the bear's story had served its purpose. As Karen reflected on her experience, she realized how much it had changed her. She had always considered herself a quiet, ordinary person, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But this journey had taught her that even small, seemingly insignificant actions could create a ripple effect. She had learned that standing up for those who couldn't speak for themselves, whether animals or people, was one of the most profound acts of courage anyone could undertake. Karen often thought about the bear, now thriving in its sanctuary. She would receive updates from the staff, complete with photos of the bear lounging in the grass or playing in its pond. Those images brought her immense joy, reminding her that compassion could truly transform lives. But they also reminded her of the responsibility we all share, to be vigilant, to be kind, and to take action when we see suffering. Her reflections became a driving force in her life. She started volunteering with local wildlife organizations, using her experience to advocate for better protections for animals. She encouraged her neighbors to stay alert and report any signs of abuse or neglect, emphasizing that every voice mattered. And though she never saw herself as a hero, Karen's story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even one person in a small, quiet neighborhood could make a difference. As Karen walked through her neighborhood one evening, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, she felt a deep sense of peace. The memory of that fateful day still lingered, but now it was accompanied by something else, the knowledge that she had done the right thing, and in doing so, she had helped not only the bear, but her community and herself. The story of the bear's rescue didn't just end with its freedom, it began a conversation that resonated far and wide. It was a powerful reminder that cruelty and suffering can hide in the most unexpected places, and that change often starts with one person taking a stand. Karen's decision to act when faced with a moral dilemma was a testament to the impact a single individual can have. Her courage sparked a chain reaction that saved not only one bear, but also brought attention to an illegal network that endangered countless others. But the bear's story is not unique. Around the world, countless animals endure lives of neglect, abuse, and captivity, often hidden from view. These animals rely on people, ordinary people like Karen, to be their voice. Reporting animal abuse or neglect might seem daunting, but it's one of the most effective ways to bring about change. Whether it's a neighbor's backyard, a neglected pet, or suspicious activity involving wildlife, taking that first step can mean the difference between a life of suffering and a second chance. The lesson here is simple. Don't turn away. If something feels wrong, trust your instincts. Call local animal control, law enforcement, or wildlife protection agencies. You don't have to be an expert or a hero, just someone willing to care enough to make the call. Your action could uncover a hidden injustice and set a ripple effect of rescue and recovery into motion. Supporting wildlife protection goes beyond reporting abuse. Consider donating to reputable organizations that rescue and rehabilitate animals, volunteer your time, or spread awareness in your community. Education is a powerful tool. By sharing stories like the bears, you inspire others to stay vigilant and compassionate. Small steps, signing a petition, attending an educational event, or advocating for stronger laws can collectively make a big difference. This story is not just about the bear, it's about all of us. It's a reminder that the power to create change is in our hands. Karen wasn't a wildlife expert or a trained rescuer. She was simply someone who chose to act when faced with injustice. Her actions are proof that compassion, even in the smallest acts, can lead to extraordinary outcomes. There's hope in knowing that one person's choice can inspire a community and beyond. The bear's transformation from a chained, suffering creature to a thriving, healthy animal shows the resilience of life and the importance of giving it a chance to heal. Each time we choose to act with kindness and empathy, we contribute to a world where cruelty is replaced with care. Let this story be a call to action. Be vigilant, be compassionate, be the voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Because sometimes it only takes one person to change everything.